So, um, I'm being asked a little bit about the principle of the jump. And, the ramp represents our launch into life. When we're at the age of accountability, we're launched into life and we're headed somewhere. And of course, the gap represents the pitfalls and darkness of this life, which, when you fall short of your destiny, fall short of the end of life, you end up in darkness. And of course, the firewall represents the gates of hell that Jesus said will not prevail against his church, his bride, the believers. And on the other side of the wall of the landing ramp is the cross that represents eternal life. And of course, as a jumper and as the stunt altogether for me, my vision is always first the takeoff ramp. My vision is not the landing, because and I learned basically this principle by watching Knievel, because it's almost like Knievel didn't have a whole lot of concern or thought about his takeoff. Mostly his thought and his direction was speed, attaining the right speed to clear the distance. But if you look at all of his mishaps, he goes through the air flat or crooked, or the front tire's low or the front tire's high. All of that's a result of his takeoff ramp, his takeoff. And the transition, the angle between the ground and the ramp. And that transition for Knievel was really dramatic. And if you look at a lot of his jumps, the faster he goes, the harder it is for him to hang on to the bike when he hits the bottom of his takeoff ramp. And that does all kinds of things to the bike. But the principle of life that I drew from it was that, you've got to, the takeoff ramp represents your launch into life. And if you don't hit that takeoff ramp correctly, if your takeoff is not right, there is no way you're going to land right. And that principle works in life. Our takeoff in life has a lot to do with, it has to do with many, many things. Your education, your relationships, your mom and dad, your friends, different types of employment that you might do as a young man, as a young boy growing up. Myself, I worked on the airport. We had the airport in Rifle, Colorado. We were crop dusters. My mom and her partner flew bombers during the war. They ferried command officers from base to base. They were WASP. They were called WASP, Women's Auxiliary Service Pilots. And so I grew up highly disciplined and grew up taking care of airplanes, taxiing, fueling, everything had to do with airplanes. And which had a very high degree of discipline. And then also I learned how to drive at a very young age. I was driving on my own at 10 years old. Learned how to fly at a very young age. Was actually flying. Early teens I was flying. And that was my takeoff ramp. Growing up under discipline and learning how to follow through with things, being faithful with things, owning up to your errors and mistakes, not trying to pass it on or cover it up or hide it. Because my mom and her partner, Betty Clark, the big thing with them was, we don't care what you do to these airplanes when you're fueling them, when you're putting them in the hangar, when you're washing them, when you're working on them. If you break something or if you injure it in some way, you've got to tell us.
Yeah, no lying.
Don't lie. I'll do this, honey. Don't lie. Don't cover it up, because a pilot's life may be at stake. And so that's what I grew up with. And so my takeoff, there was the greatest concern for life growing up was my takeoff. That was my launch into life. My launch into life was high degree of discipline, taking care of people, looking after people, being faithful to the little things, sweeping the hangars out. I mean, think about this. One of our weekly jobs was having a push broom sweeping out a hangar that housed 4 airplanes. So, which we didn't enjoy that, but it was part of what we had to do. So that was my takeoff ramp. And of course, the gap was really, the gap in life to me represents dead time, or unimportant time, or undisciplined time. The gap between the takeoff and the landing kind of represents your free time. The time when nobody's looking over your shoulder, the time when you're on your own, doing what you want to do, kind of your own boss, you're your own boss. That's kind of how I see the gap in life. And a lot of people don't do well with that. Some of them, and I noticed this when I went in the Navy. I worked on the flight deck. I was the flight deck director and crash crew director for the flight deck. And as long as the sailors, during flight quarters and when they were under direct authority, they did their job. But if you ever went on liberty with the sailors, good luck. And there were only a few sailors I ever hit the beach with, because the rest of these guys were just loose cannons. They drank too much. They got in fights. They just weren't anybody you wanted to hang around with. Well, I look at that as the gap, the inactivity between, the takeoff ramp has activity, the landing ramp has activity, the gap has nothing going on. It's just dead air. There's nothing there. There may be cars or whatever, but there's no activity there. That's the object of life, is to get off the takeoff ramp in a correct position at the correct speed, having control or government over your life, which is your bike, and in such a way so that you'll clear the gap, the inactivities of life, all the self, recreation and all of that. You'll clear that safely. You'll manage your way through that safely so that you can land on the other side, which the first thing on the other side is the wall of fire. It's the gates of hell. That is a great resistance, and that resists you breaking through to eternal life. And so when I went off the takeoff ramp, my focus was no longer the takeoff ramp. My focus was the wall, because that was what I was going to have to negotiate and penetrate and break through in a right attitude and a right angle so that I could safely land on the other side and ride down the landing ramp. So that's kind of what all of that represents. And
how you take off is how you land.
Yeah, and really how you launch is how you land. And it's everything in life. And looking at our ministry over 51 years, my personal ministry, looking at the people we have to deal with in the church, out of the church, the religious people, the Jesus people, which aren't really the same. Religious people follow laws, do's and don'ts. Christian people, true Christians, follow the spirit of life. and they're governed by their conscience, and they're governed by right and wrong, not written right and wrong, but as the Spirit leads them and as the Spirit convicts them. So, and this is, and that is, if you're trained right in the beginning, you manage the gap, the recreation times of your life, the inactivity times of your life, you govern that, and you maintain the discipline of the takeoff principle through the gap of life. You maintain that discipline through the gap. If you do that, you'll land right. Most of the people we have to deal with have very poor takeoffs. They have a very poor discipline. They have a very poor instruction in their life, how they grew up, who their friends were, what kind of education they had, what kind of places they worked, the culture they were in. All of that's your takeoff. And most of the people we're ministering to are people that have had a terrible takeoff experience, and they're in and out of the gap. They're in and out of, whether it's alcoholism or drugs or permissiveness, whatever. It's like you're constantly pulling people out of the gap. And the Lord's, of course, Jesus's vision for all of us is that we clear the gap, the pitfalls and gaps of life. We clear it so that we can safely land on the other side, break through, bust through the gates of hell, which he breaks for us, landing on the cross, on the landing ramp, the other side of this life, which is fulfilling your personal destiny and entering into eternal life. That's kind of the little story. So I'd say most of our ministry is trying to help young people and help even elderly people never had a good takeoff experience. And it's like the Lord wants to bring them back to their takeoff ramp, to their experience that sent them off through life, that caused them to always fall and be tormented and lose things. And so the greater part of our ministry is toward helping people with their takeoff ramp.
Hear the voice and do it instead of doing the
Hearing the
traditions
voice,
of men.
Anyway, that's about
Okay.
all I want to say about that.